Hello and welcome. Whether you're listening in the quiet hours of the night or enjoying a slow, thoughtful moment during the day, this gentle journey invites you to step into a land after the rush has faded. Make yourself comfortable, let your breath ease and settle, allow the echoes of excitement and ambition to grow soft. Together, we'll drift into the calm that followed one of the most transformative moments in American history. This is what came after the California Gold Rush, a peaceful, reflective exploration of a place forever changed by hope, hardship, and time. Take a slow, steady breath. As you exhale, imagine the hills and valleys of California under a wide open sky. The mining camps are quieter now. Riverbeds that once shimmered with promise flow gently again, carrying only water and memory. In this serene retelling, there is no frenzy, no competition, only observation. We move slowly through the aftermath, noticing how towns settled, how landscapes bore their scars, and how lives reshaped themselves once the gold was gone. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a small, growing town. Wooden buildings line dusty streets, gardens begin to replace tents, and the sound of hammers and footsteps carries softly through the air. Some dreams were fulfilled, others left behind, but something lasting took root. Though you remain comfortably where you are, you can almost sense the quiet determination of those who stayed, choosing to build homes, communities, and futures from what remained. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how California transformed after the gold rush, how its economy shifted, how cities grew, how cultures blended, and how the land itself was forever altered. We'll move gently through these changes, letting history unfold like a long sunset over the western hills. For now, settle in, breathe deeply, and allow this calm journey into post-Gold Rush California to begin. Echoes of a golden storm. In the mid-19th century, California witnessed a tempest of humanity and hope known as the Gold Rush. Between 1848 and 1855, hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers poured into this previously remote frontier, forever transforming its destiny. Before the rush, California's population was only around 160,000, mostly Native American. By 1855, over 300,000 newcomers had arrived from across the United States and the world. They came by ship and wagon, lured by news of gold flakes spotted in the American River. In those feverish early years, tent cities and mining camps sprang up along rivers and in the Sierra Nevada foothills. San Francisco ballooned from a tiny hamlet into a bustling port, the harbor choked with deserted ships whose crews had fled for the gold fields. Amid the clamor of miners shouting "Eureka," Greek for "I have found it," a new social and economic order was taking root. By 1850, California had skipped the usual territorial phase and entered the Union directly as a state, a speedy entry hastened by the gold rush boom. The discovery at Sutter's Mill had set off more than a frenzy. It sparked a profound and enduring change in California's landscape and people. Yet as with all booms, the gold rush's intense blaze eventually dimmed. By the end of the 1850s, the easily panned gold deposits were largely exhausted, and the frenzied rush of the 49ers gave way to a quieter reality. In place of transient mining camps arose more permanent towns with streets, schools, and courthouses. Those settlements that could not transition to new livelihoods fell silent, becoming ghost towns among the pines. California's story did not end when the gold ran out. Instead, a new chapter began. In the gentle light of the following decades, the state transformed in unexpected ways. The clink of shovels in riverbeds yielded to the rustle of wheat fields and the whistle of steam trains. The lawless excitement of boomtowns evolved into structured civic life, but not without trials and turmoil. What came after the California Gold Rush was an era of growth and change, one of both hope and hardship that would shape the Golden State's identity long after the gold itself was gone. The gold rush fades from bonanza to bust. As the 1850s progressed, prospectors found gold ever harder to come by. The placers, those rich surface deposits and creek beds, had been largely picked clean by early arrivals. By 1852, California's gold production peaked at an astonishing $81 million, but it began declining sharply thereafter. Year by year, individual miners saw their daily takings dwindle. Many lone miner adventurers gave up, their dreams of easy riches dashed. In a typical pattern seen in other rushes, the era of the lone prospector with a pick and pan yielded to an era of industrial mining. Organized companies with heavy machinery and investment capital moved in to extract the gold that remained buried in the hills. For those with means, a deep rock mining, tunneling into quartz veins, promised another way to find gold, but it required expensive equipment and labor. And for a time, a new technique, hydraulic mining, offered a second gold boom of sorts, albeit at a high cost, as we shall see later. By the late 1850s, the fever of the gold rush had cooled to a sober realization. The era of easy gold was over. Town newspapers that once brimmed with accounts of rich strikes now carried more stories of mine closures and departures. In mining camps, murmurs grew that the diggings were played out. Nothing of importance found in weeks, one might hear around a dwindling campfire as weary men contemplated their next move. Some diehards stayed on, eking out a living prospecting ever more remote canyons or reworking old claims. Others packed their bags and drifted away, joining new rushes in places like the Fraser River in Canada, 1858, or the Silver Lodes of Nevada from 1859. Many simply returned home, their pockets lighter, but their eyes filled with tales of adventure. Those who remained in California often had to reinvent themselves. The luckiest miners took what gold they had and invested in businesses or land. Far more common were men who, finding themselves with little to show for years of digging, hired on as laborers, teamsters, or farmhands. A reporter in 1858 described abandoned sluice boxes and crumbling flumes along the banks of the Yuba and American rivers, relics of dreams that had literally run dry. The land itself, scarred by thousands of prospecting pits and tailings piles, began to rest. In the cool dawns of the Sierra foothills, one could now hear birdsong again, where once there was the constant roar of prospectors' rockers and sluices. The great gold bonanza had given way to a quieter time, but California was already moving on to its next act, with new industries and opportunities rising from the shadow of the gold fields. New wealth from the earth. Agriculture takes center stage. When gold mining yielded diminishing returns, many in California turned their gaze from streams to soil. This pivot gave birth to what some early settlers called green gold, the plentiful harvests from California's fertile land. The same mild climate and rich valleys that had attracted only passing notice during the gold frenzy now revealed their true value. By the mid-1850s, frustrated miners by the hundreds traded pickaxes for plows. They staked out homesteads or bought plots in the broad Central Valley and coastal plains, determined to make a living by cultivation rather than speculation. In the decade after the gold rush, California agriculture burgeoned at a remarkable pace. Indeed, even as early as 1852, the very peak year of gold production, wheat farming and other crop production began a sharp rise. Contemporaries marveled that by 1854, the young state not only fed itself, but was producing surplus grain for export, something few would have predicted during the chaotic mining boom. Settlers discovered that California's valleys could be immensely productive. Wheat became a dominant crop, especially in the 18th and 1870s, when vast golden wheat fields swayed in the summer breezes of the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys. By the 1880s, California was harvesting over 1 million tons of wheat each year and had become one of the nation's great breadbaskets. Barley, too, thrived. By 1860, California led the United States in barley production. The state's cattle ranchers, the old Spanish Californios, and new American ranchers alike, also benefited from new markets as the growing population and mining camps created high demand for meat and leather. Fortunes were made supplying beef to hungry miners during the early 1850s, and although those profits leveled off after the rush, cattle ranching remained an important industry. In addition, enterprising newcomers explored crops suited to the Mediterranean climate. Former miners from Europe introduced orchards and vineyards. Winemaking took root in the 1850s when immigrant farmers, notably many with French and German heritage, planted grapes in the foothills and valleys. By the 1860s, California wines and fruits were not only enjoyed locally, but were starting to be shipped to eastern markets. Gordon Early Vintner proudly exported California olives and wines, writing that the state's second gold rush would be in orchards and vineyards. Indeed, California's fruit production, oranges in Southern California, grapes and apples in the north, soared in the later 19th century, laying groundwork for the agricultural cornucopia the state is known for today. All of this agricultural growth was not without challenges. Early farmers contended with uncertain land titles, a legacy of Spanish and Mexican land grants, discussed later, and a primitive transportation network. In the 1850s, getting produce to market from the interior could be slow and costly. A bushel of wheat might have to travel by wagon ruts to a riverboat, then down rivers to San Francisco's harbor. But year by year, infrastructure improved, especially with the coming of railroads, as we shall soon explore. The expanding farming economy also triggered California's first environmental debates. Irrigation was needed to turn arid lands green, foreshadowing future water struggles, and the practices of miners sometimes ran directly counter to the needs of farmers, as hydraulic mining sent floods of debris that could wreck farmlands downstream. These conflicts between the golden harvest and the golden ore would come to a head in the 1870s. For now, however, through the 1850s and 60s, agriculture steadily established itself as California's new economic backbone, a calmer, steadier source of wealth than the wild fluctuations of gold. In the gentle rhythm of planting and harvest, many who once chased fickle fortune found a more sustainable prosperity in California's sunlit fields. Iron horses and new frontiers, railroads, commerce, and banking. As farms spread and towns grew, California faced a pressing need to connect its people and markets. During the gold rush, the state had been a far-flung frontier, accessible only by arduous sea voyages or overland treks. But in the years after, a revolution in transportation shrank the continent. The most transformative development was the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad. In the 1860s, California's Big Four industrialists, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, financed and built the western leg of this vast project, the Central Pacific Railroad, starting from Sacramento. Hammering eastward with thousands of laborers, predominantly Chinese workers, whose story we will touch on later, the Central Pacific laid tracks over the towering Sierra Nevada. In May 1869, the final golden spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, linking California by rail to the rest of the United States. For the first time, one could travel from San Francisco Bay to New York Bay in a week or two rather than months. This iron road knit California firmly into the nation, and as historian Malcolm J. Rohrbaugh observed, it solidified San Francisco's position as the dominant western city of the 19th century. The railroads did more than move people. They opened vast new economic possibilities. Farmers could ship their wheat, fruit, and wine to distant markets before they spoiled, turning local surpluses into national commodities. The Central Pacific, later part of the Southern Pacific Company, extended lines throughout California in the 1870s, reaching south to Los Angeles and San Diego and north to Oregon. Remote towns rejoiced at the sight of the gleaming locomotive, the Iron Horse, chugging into their valley for the first time, its whistle echoing off the hills. With the rails came telegraph lines, post offices, and the reliable schedules of commerce. By the 1880s, wheat from the Central Valley could be loaded onto trains and then onto ships bound for Europe, making California a player in global grain markets. Small wonder that by the end of the 19th century, California was both an agricultural powerhouse and a transportation hub linking the Pacific world with the Atlantic. Commerce flourished in other ways too. The gold rush had seeded a vibrant mercantile sector, businesses supplying miners with equipment, clothing, and services. In the post-rush era, some of these businesses grew into California's first major companies. Notably, banking and finance took off as gold profits and agricultural wealth accumulated. In 1852, Henry Wells and William Fargo founded Wells, Fargo and Coitus, initially an express mail and banking company for Gold Country, which soon became a pillar of Western finance. Around the same time, other banks formed in booming San Francisco, including the Bank of California in 1864. San Francisco's financial district, Wall Street of the West, emerged to fund railroads, mines, and shipping lines. Indeed, by the 1870s, San Francisco reputedly had more millionaires per capita than even New York. This wealth was not only from gold. Significant fortunes came from silver, especially the nearby Comstock Lode in Nevada, from land speculation, and from commerce in goods ranging from lumber to canned fruits. All these developments helped California transition from a transient mining economy to a diversified, modern one. Factories were established to build railroad cars and mining equipment. Foundries and machine shops, some of which originally built stamp mills for gold ore, started manufacturing farm machinery, pumps, and tools. The port of San Francisco buzzed with ships carrying Californian wheat, timber, and wool outward, and bringing in coal, machinery, and immigrants. Entrepreneurial figures like Levi Strauss, a Bavarian immigrant who had sold sturdy canvas trousers to miners, expanded into a global clothing business, selling blue jeans far beyond the Sierra Nevada. Meanwhile, inventors and engineers found fertile ground in the state's boom. Early experiments in telegraphy and electricity took place here, and by the 1870s, electric lights and streetcars would appear in cities like San Francisco. By the late 19th century, an observer could see that California's wealth no longer glittered only in pouches of gold dust. It was embedded in rail lines stretching across the land, in rows of crops reaching the horizon, and in the rising brick facades of banks and trading houses in the cities. California had become, in essence, an economic powerhouse. The frantic rush for gold had given way to the steady hum of commerce and industry. In the calm of a California evening, one might hear not the shout of Eureka from a canyon, but the distant whistle of a train or the lowing of cattle on a ranch. The new sounds of prosperity in a land that had found wealth beyond gold. Forging a state, politics, and law in the post-rush era. The gold rush not only transformed California's economy, it utterly upended its political and legal landscape. In a breathtakingly short time, California went from a sparsely governed military territory, just ceded by Mexico in 1848, to a full-fledged state with American laws and institutions. With the influx of English-speaking settlers and the tumult of the gold fields, there was an urgent need for order. In late 1849, even as miners kept arriving, California's new settlers convened a constitutional convention. They drafted a state constitution in English and Spanish and boldly applied for statehood. Congress agreed, and by September 9, 1850, California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state. Remarkably, just 2 years after the United States had acquired it, and without ever having been an organized U.S. territory. This rapid path to statehood was largely propelled by the gold rush population boom and the desire of Californians to establish a civilian government to maintain public order. In the early 1850s, the new state legislature in Sacramento faced the daunting task of extending American law over a rowdy, diverse populace. One of the first acts was to divide California into counties and set up courts and law enforcement. But on the ground, law was often hard to enforce, and justice could be haphazard. The state's birth was accompanied by a welter of legal issues unique to California's sudden circumstances. For example, land ownership was a major concern. Existing Spanish-Mexican land grants had to be respected under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. But with so many newcomers pouring in, conflicts erupted between Mexican-era ranch owners, the Californios, and squatters or speculators. The U.S. Congress passed the California Land Act of 1851, requiring all holders of Mexican grants to prove their claims before a new land commission. While the commission eventually confirmed most valid grants, the process led to long court battles. Many California ranchers had to spend small fortunes on lawyers or sell parts of their land to pay taxes and debts during the proceedings. It was a protracted struggle that often ended with the old ranch families losing large portions of their estates. As one historian noted, after the discovery of gold, Californios lost their dominance over the affairs of the state and the vast tracts of land they originally possessed. By the 1860s, much of the prime land had shifted into American hands, profoundly changing landholding patterns in the state. The California legislature also grappled with the chaotic social consequences of the gold rush. Crime had surged in the lawless early days, and one infamous response was vigilantism, covered in the next section on social unrest. The legislature passed laws to impose taxes and order in the mines, notably the foreign miners' license tax. First enacted in 1850, this law aimed to discourage foreign miners by levying a hefty fee of $20 per month on non-U.S. citizens. It was repealed after an outcry and threats of international incident, but in 1852, a new foreign miners' tax was imposed at a lower rate of $3 per month, this time mostly enforced against Chinese miners. Such legislation reflected the rising American dominance in California and blatant prejudice in law, essentially trying to drive out competition by making foreign, especially Chinese and Latin American, miners pay for the privilege of working claims. In 1850, another law with grim implications was passed, the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Despite its benign title, this state law enabled the forced apprenticeship, in effect indentured servitude, of Native American children and convicted vagrants, and it led to kidnappings and abuse of Native people. Combined with the violence of that era, discussed further below, California's early legal environment virtually stripped Native Californians of rights and personhood, despite California technically being admitted as a free state without slavery. Politically, the 1850s in California saw rapid shifts. The first state capital was in San Jose in 1850, then briefly in Vallejo and Benicia, before settling in Sacramento in 1854. Early governors and legislators were often 49ers themselves. In fact, 8 of the first 10 governors of California had come during the gold rush. These leaders had to contend with everything from vigilante violence to the state's finances. California assumed a load of debt from public works and militia expeditions against tribes. By the 1860s, during the Civil War, California remained in the Union, and its politics leaned free soil, anti-slavery, due to its origin as a free state. However, deep divisions existed, including clashes between the emerging Republican Party, strengthened by miners and business interests, and Democrats, including many Southern sympathizers and the old California elites. One of the most significant political shifts came in the 1870s, in the wake of economic downturn. After a severe recession known as the Panic of 1873 and the collapse of some major banks, like the Bank of California in 1875, popular discontent grew. In 1877, San Francisco saw violent anti-Chinese riots, more on this later, and a new political force, the Working Men's Party of California, led by a fiery agitator named Dennis Kearney, rose on a platform of curbing the power of the railroad barons and ending Chinese immigration. This movement helped push through a new state constitution in 1879, which dramatically reshaped California law. The 1879 Constitution, California's second, included provisions to regulate railroad freight rates and curb monopolies, reflecting the anger at the powerful Central Southern Pacific Railroad. It also, unfortunately, enshrined some of the most discriminatory policies against Chinese residents. Article 9 of the new Constitution prohibited corporations and government from hiring Chinese, and even allowed local governments to force Chinese out of their limits. Although some of these anti-Chinese provisions were later struck down by courts or rendered void by federal law, their inclusion shows how the political climate had shifted towards nativism and labor unrest. By the end of the 19th century, California had a more mature legal and political system, but one deeply marked by the struggles of its early years. The Wild West period of ad hoc justice had gradually been brought under the rule of law, yet the laws themselves reflected the prejudices and power struggles of the era. Through calm nights in Sacramento, one imagines lawmakers burning the midnight oil to craft rules for this dynamic new society, even as, outside, the state grew and changed in ways they could scarcely control. California's transition from a gold rush anarchy to an organized state was tumultuous, but it laid the foundations, good and bad, for the California we know today. Boomtowns into cities, urban life after the rush. During the gold rush, California's settlements were haphazard affairs, tent cities, and muddy streets teeming with prospectors, merchants, gamblers, and adventurers from around the globe. After the rush subsided, many of these places transformed dramatically. The clamor of gold camps slowly yielded to the more orderly bustle of permanent towns and cities. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in San Francisco, which grew from a tiny village called Yerba Buena into the preeminent metropolis of the American West. In 1848, San Francisco had perhaps a few hundred residents. By 1852, its population swelled to around 35,000, and it would continue to climb to over 150,000 by 1870. What had been a rugged tent and shack town in 1849 became within a decade or two a city of hotels, theaters, newspapers, and Victorian houses climbing its famous hills. San Francisco in 1851, just a few years into the gold rush, was already transforming from a sleepy hamlet into a bustling city by the bay. Wooden buildings and tents crowded Portsmouth Square as the harbor beyond filled with ships. Over the following decades, San Francisco grew into a cosmopolitan urban center, the gateway to the Pacific, while still retaining a frontier vibrancy. In San Francisco's early post-rush years, growth was as tumultuous as the boom itself. The city suffered devastating fires half a dozen times between 1849 and 1851, as wooden buildings and canvas tents easily went up in flames. Each time San Franciscans rebuilt with determination, using sturdier brick and stone. By the late 1850s, the city had gaslight street lamps, policemen in uniforms, and boarding houses lining dirt and often muddy streets. The notorious Barbary Coast District still boomed with dance halls and saloons, but respectable businesses and genteel society were also staking their claims. The opening of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 ensured San Francisco's dominance, making it the western terminus of America's commerce. As one historian put it, the railroad solidified San Francisco's position as the West's capital of finance and trade. The city's ports bustled with not only gold seekers, but now wheat shipments, lumber, and manufactured goods. By the 1870s, cable cars began climbing the steep streets. The first cable car line launched in 1873 on Clay Street, and elegant mansions crowned Nob Hill, built by railroad magnates and silver barons who looked down, literally and figuratively, on the city they helped enrich. Beyond San Francisco, other towns born of the gold rush found new life or faded away. Sacramento, which started as a river landing for miners and the commercial hub of the northern mines, evolved into a proper capital city. Located at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers, Sacramento had boomed early as a gateway to the gold fields. But it faced its own trials, notably the catastrophic flood of early 1862, when torrential rains and snowmelt turned the Sacramento Valley into an inland sea. Sacramento's streets were submerged. Residents navigated downtown by boat, and the newly inaugurated governor, Leland Stanford, supposedly had to take a rowboat to his capital office in January 1862. In response, Sacramentans undertook the colossal task of raising the level of the downtown streets by several feet, building sturdier levees, and even physically jacking up buildings, an engineering feat that demonstrated their commitment to the city's future. By the 1870s, Sacramento had solidified its role as the state government seat and a vital agricultural trading center, with the Southern Pacific Railroad yards providing many jobs. Although smaller than San Francisco, Sacramento's tree-lined streets and growing suburbs gave it a steady, civic character. One could stroll past the new Capitol building, completed in 1874, an elegant white domed structure, on a warm evening and sense California's transition from frontier to establishment. Other gold country towns had mixed fates. Stockton, sitting on the San Joaquin River, became a durable city thanks to its position as a supply center for mines and farms alike. With riverboat connections and later railroads, Stockton grew into an agricultural and manufacturing hub, known for flour mills and iron foundries that originally served mining equipment needs. Marysville and Columbia were once booming mining towns. Marysville prospered for a time as a trade center, but gradually declined when the gold in its hinterlands gave out and railroads bypassed it. Columbia, in the Sierra foothills, was reputed to be the second largest city in California around 1852, but when its gold depleted, so it largely emptied. Today it survives as a preserved historic park, a snapshot of a once bustling diggings town turned semi-ghost town. Virginia City in Nevada, though outside California, it drew many Californians in the 1860s with the Comstock Lode Silver Strike, had a similar trajectory, a roaring boom, and then a slide into quietude. These examples dotted the map. Places like Placerville, Sonora, Grass Valley, Nevada City. Some managed to transition to quartz mining or became local market towns, while others shrank to mere shadows of their former glory. The growth of Los Angeles during this period was a different story. Los Angeles had been a relatively sleepy pueblo in 1850, with around 1,600 residents, known more for cattle ranching and vineyards than for gold. Southern California had not experienced a gold rush like the North. In the post-gold rush decades, Los Angeles slowly grew, particularly after the Southern Pacific Railroad linked it to the rest of the state in 1876. By 1880, Los Angeles had about 11,000 people, a fraction of San Francisco's size, but its boosters were already eyeing its potential. The late 1870s and 1880s land boom in Southern California, fueled by its climate and railroad-fostered tourism, would soon swell LA's population. However, during the immediate aftermath of the gold rush, Los Angeles remained a small, if intriguing, multi-ethnic town with sizable Californio, Anglo, and Chinese communities, surrounded by orange groves and ranches. It was not yet the focus of the state's attention, that remained firmly in the north, in the Bay and mining regions. But its time was coming. By the 1880s, California could boast several substantial urban centers. San Francisco was by far the largest, over 230,000 people by 1880, followed by growing Oakland across the bay, Sacramento in the interior, and smaller hubs like San Jose and San Diego. These cities had newspapers, streetcars, gas lights, and expanding neighborhoods. The cultural life also blossomed. San Francisco had opera houses, literary societies, and Chinatown's vibrant streets. Sacramento had its state fair and political pageantry. A traveler in 1880 might take a train from the hustle and clamor of San Francisco's Market Street, thronged with bankers, dock workers, ladies in fine bonnets, and Chinese shopkeepers, and reach the quieter provincial capital of Sacramento in a matter of hours, noticing along the way how the landscape changed from bay marshes to endless fields of wheat and orchards. Each city and town told a piece of the story of how California moved beyond the rough and tumble mining era into a more settled pattern of urban life. Yet echoes of the gold rush remained in these urban centers. In San Francisco's Barbary Coast, one might still find old miners swapping stories in saloons, telling tall tales of 49. In the names of neighborhoods and buildings, Nob Hill, where railroad nabobs built mansions, Irish Hill, Chinatown, Hangtown, Placerville's nickname, the legacy of those early years persisted. The cities had grown up, but they never forgot that they were born in a moment of gold-fueled chaos and opportunity. And in a very real sense, the cosmopolitan character of places like San Francisco, with Italians, Chinese, Irish, Latin Americans, Germans, and more living in close quarters, was a direct inheritance from the gold rush's global reach. In the soft evenings after the rush, city dwellers could walk along streets once paved with mud and littered with gold prospecting gear, now replaced by cobblestones and gas lamps. The air might carry the sound of a ship's horn on the bay or a train whistle in the distance. California's urban journey had begun in the wild rush and was settling into something more enduring. Communities with roots, where churches, schools, and businesses outnumbered gambling halls, and where the dreams of fortune were channeled into building a future for the next generation. Waves of newcomers, immigration, and diversity in post-rush California. The gold rush had been a magnet for people from all corners of the globe, and in its aftermath, California retained a remarkably diverse populace for the era. The years after 1855 saw continued immigration, though the composition and reception of these newcomers evolved over time. The initial rush had brought large numbers of Americans from the eastern states, along with Latin Americans, especially Mexicans, Chileans, and Peruvians, Europeans, British, us Irish, German, French, Italian, etc., Australians, and famously a significant influx of Chinese immigrants. With gold prospects dwindling, many non-Americans who had come from mining left California. For example, some Latin American miners returned home or moved on to new gold strikes in British Columbia or Colorado. But many others stayed, planting the seeds of California's multicultural communities. One of the most consequential demographic stories was that of the Chinese in California. The first Chinese workers arrived during the early gold rush around 1849 to 50, and by 1852, their numbers had swelled to about 25,000. Initially, they were drawn by the lure of Gold Mountain, as California was called in Cantonese. They mostly came from southern China's Guangdong province, escaping poverty and turmoil at home, and were typically young men who hoped to make some money and perhaps return to their families eventually. They soon constituted a significant portion of the mining workforce, especially in diggings that American miners had abandoned as less profitable. By 1860, roughly 35,000 Chinese people lived in California, nearly 1/10 of the state's population. They fanned out in mining regions, worked as cooks and launderers in towns, reclaimed swampy delta land for farming, and when the Great Railroad push began in the 1860s, thousands of Chinese laborers became the backbone of the Central Pacific Railroad's construction over the Sierra. The Chinese community centered in San Francisco's Chinatown, which by the 1870s had grown into a vibrant enclave with temples, shops, theaters, and tightly packed boarding houses. Chinatown was both admired as exotic and denigrated by many white San Franciscans. It became the most visible symbol of Asian immigration in America. By 1880, over 105,000 people of Chinese origin were in the United States, the vast majority in California and the West, making up more than 1/10 of California's population. This wave of Chinese immigration was part of what made 19th century California so distinctive. Chinese workers contributed enormously. They quite literally helped build the state's infrastructure and drove its economy in sectors like agriculture, as seasonal laborers in fields and orchards, and manufacturing, notably the garment industry in San Francisco. However, as the gold rush receded and labor markets tightened, especially during economic downturns, many white Californians reacted to Chinese immigration with hostility and racism. Resentment festered that the Chinese, who often would work for lower wages and were not citizens, were undercutting free white labor. The ethnic and cultural differences, Chinese immigrants largely kept their customs, languages, and formed separate communities, fueled prejudice and misunderstanding. This culminated in anti-Chinese movements that swept through California in the 1870s. Slogans like "The Chinese must go" became political rallying cries. Even some labor leaders who initially were concerned with broader issues turned their focus almost entirely to driving out the Chinese, blaming them without justification for low wages and scarce jobs during the Depression. Tensions occasionally boiled over into violence. In 1871, in Los Angeles, a mob massacred around 18 Chinese residents during a terrible night of racial violence. And most notoriously, in San Francisco in 1877, rallies of the unemployed on the city's sandlots turned into anti-Chinese pogroms. One evening in July 1876, a crowd gathered near City Hall, ostensibly for a labor meeting, but agitators incited them with the cry of "On to Chinatown." What followed was chaos. Mobs rampaged through Chinese neighborhoods, burning laundries and attacking anyone of Chinese appearance. The police were overwhelmed and ineffective in stopping the destruction. Over several days, violence flared and several people were killed. It was one of the worst race riots in California's history. In the aftermath, volunteer vigilantes and eventually the National Guard restored order in San Francisco, but the fear and hostility toward Chinese immigrants had been starkly revealed. This anti-Chinese agitation helped spur state and eventually federal action. California politicians had already written anti-Chinese measures into the 1879 state constitution, as mentioned earlier, effectively banning Chinese employment on public works and encouraging municipalities to segregate the Chinese. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by the U.S. Congress, the first major law to restrict immigration explicitly based on race/nationality. It barred almost all new Chinese immigrants and became a long-lasting policy, renewed and extended for decades. As a result, the Chinese population in California actually began to decline after 1882, and the imbalance of men to women, since very few Chinese women had been allowed to immigrate, meant the community's growth was stifled. By 1900, Chinese immigrants and their American-born children were a smaller fraction of California's population than in 1880, and they lived under increased segregation and legal disabilities. Still, the Chinese community survived, preserving their rich cultural heritage and contributing in quieter ways to California life, such as developing agriculture through their labor and introducing diverse cuisines and traditions that would later be embraced. Aside from the Chinese, other immigrant groups also left their mark on post-rush California. The Californios, Mexican Californians, and other Hispanics remained an important presence, especially in the South and rural areas, though they too faced discrimination and loss of land. After the U.S. takeover, Californios had briefly held political power. Some served in early legislatures or local offices, but by the 1860s, their influence waned dramatically. Many old families lost their ranchos, and with them, their economic base. Yet their cultural legacy in language, law, community property, for instance, was adopted in California law from Spanish tradition, and place names remained integral. During the late 19th century, relatively fewer Mexican immigrants came compared to later periods, but there was continuous movement across the border for work, especially in ranching and agriculture. European immigrants continued arriving in the post-gold rush decades. The Irish, who had come in large numbers, some directly, some after working on East Coast or railroad projects, formed a significant community in San Francisco. By the 1870s, the Irish made up a sizable portion of the city's working class. They established Catholic churches and schools, and some Irish immigrants, like Dennis Kearney, leader of the Workingmen's Party, became politically prominent, sometimes, unfortunately, channeling nativist sentiments against the Chinese. Germans also arrived in considerable numbers. Many went into brewing, San Francisco's beer industry, and Sonoma-Napa wine industries had German roots, commerce, and farming. Italians found their niche in fishing. San Francisco's North Beach became an Italian enclave of fishermen and entrepreneurs, and later in farming and vineyards. French immigrants had a strong presence in San Francisco too, with French restaurants, bakeries, and even a French hospital, a legacy of Gold Rush-era arrivals from France. Scandinavians, notably Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, started communities, often pursuing farming or logging in Northern California or fishing along the coast. Chinese, Japanese, Punjabi, Filipino, and other Asian groups that would significantly shape California. But Japanese and South Asian immigration picked up more in the late 1880s and 1890s, and Filipinos after 1900, when the Philippines came under U.S. rule. In the immediate post-Gold Rush era, the Chinese were the main Asian immigrant group. One should also note the movement of people from other parts of the United States. Thousands of Americans who had come for gold decided to stay even when the gold was gone. Some sent for their families or sweethearts from back east, resulting in a growing population of women and children by the late 1850s and 1860s. In 1850, men vastly outnumbered women in California. That ratio gradually normalized as families established roots. The influence of these domestic migrants was profound. They brought American cultural institutions, schools, volunteer fire, brigades, literary societies, and more. New Englanders, Midwesterners, and Southerners each contributed elements of their regional culture, mixing in the great social experiment that was California. For example, New Englanders helped found some of the first public libraries and colleges. African Americans also formed communities, though small in number, a few thousand by 1860, many having come as personal servants or slaves during the gold rush and then freed by California's free state status. They established churches and advocated for civil rights. Figures like Mary Ellen Pleasant in San Francisco championed equality, and California saw early court cases challenging segregation of public facilities as early as the 1860s. In daily life, this diversity made California both fascinating and occasionally fractious. Walk through San Francisco in 1866 and you'd hear a cacophony of tongues, Spanish spoken by a group of Californios on a street corner, Cantonese shouted by fish vendors, Italian sung by a barber, German in a beer hall, and of course the varied accents of English from New York, Georgia, or London. Such cosmopolitan scenes were rare in most of America at that time. California's mix of peoples was part of its frontier legacy. It fostered a rich cultural life, varied cuisines. One might find a Mexican cantina next to a French patisserie, multi-ethnic celebrations, and a general air of openness to new ways. But it also produced flashpoints of racial and ethnic tension. Prejudices ran deep against certain groups, leading to the aforementioned anti-Chinese riots, anti-Mexican violence in some rural areas, and everyday discrimination. Despite the challenges, by the end of the 19th century, California's identity as a diverse mosaic was well established. This diversity would, in the long run, become one of California's greatest strengths, fueling innovation and cultural richness. In the serene perspective of history, one can look back and see how each wave of newcomers, whether drawn by gold or by the promise of farmland or a fresh start, added a thread to California's tapestry. Under the same wide blue skies, these different peoples worked, traded, sometimes clashed, but together built the foundation of modern California. In the evenings, in a town like Stockton or San Jose, one might see families of different origins strolling in the town plaza, some singing old country songs, others listening curiously, as children played and the sun set golden over the western hills, reminding all of the land that had brought them together. Struggles for order, vigilantes, violence, and early labor, unrest. In the wake of the gold rush, California was a place of both great opportunity and great instability. The sudden influx of population had outpaced the creation of formal law enforcement and governance, especially in the early 1850s. As a result, communities sometimes took matters of justice into their own hands. This era saw the rise of the famous and infamous vigilance committees in San Francisco and other areas, as citizens organized to combat crime, or what they perceived as threats, outside the slow or corrupt official legal system. Over time, as California's economy shifted and labor forces grew, different forms of unrest emerged as well, notably the beginnings of labor movements and social protests against economic inequality. Together, these threads form a narrative of a society trying to impose order and fairness amid rapid change. Vigilante justice in the cities. San Francisco in the early 1850s was a tinderbox of crime and political corruption. During the peak of the gold rush, it had attracted not only honest merchants and miners, but also gamblers, con men, and convicts from around the world. A gang of Australian ex-convicts, known as the Sydney Ducks, was particularly notorious for lawlessness. Robbery, arson, and murder plagued the city's nights. Regular courts and police were either overwhelmed or in some cases complicit in corruption. In 1851, after a series of fires and violent crimes went unpunished, one report tallied over 100 murders in a short span with no convictions. Leading citizens of San Francisco decided to form a committee of vigilance. This vigilance committee was essentially a parallel government, an armed association of respectable townsmen, merchants, tradesmen, even some clergy, who pledged to protect the city and enforce justice by any means necessary. Led by figures like Sam Brannan, a prominent businessman and Mormon elder, the committee took decisive and extra-legal action. They arrested known gang leaders, held quick trials, often in secret, and meted out summary punishments, including deportation, whipping, and even hanging. In 1851, the San Francisco vigilantes executed at least 4 men by hanging for crimes like burglary and assault, and forced many others to leave the city. While their methods were harsh, many locals approved, feeling that finally some order was being restored. The sight of vigilantes marching prisoners through the streets or the tolling of the vigilance bell summoning members to action became part of city lore. A few years later, in 1856, San Francisco's civic troubles flared again. Politics in the city had grown particularly venal, and gang violence tied to political factions was endemic. The murder of a prominent editor, James King of William, who crusaded against corruption, by a local politician was the final spark. The Committee of Vigilance reformed, this time even larger, swelling to some 6,000 members, essentially a private army of the city's middle and upper-class citizens. They seized the accused murderer, who had connections in the sheriff's office, as well as another man who had killed a vigilante back in 1851, and executed both. The 1856 vigilantes then went further. They effectively took control of San Francisco for several months, conducting searches, deporting a number of people, especially criminals and some political enemies, including officials they deemed corrupt, and instituting their own checkpoints and patrols. In total, across 1851 and 1856, the San Francisco Vigilance Committees lynched at least 8 people, kidnapped, arrested, and exiled hundreds, and forced several corrupt officials to resign. They justified their actions as necessary for the public good, adopting mottos like "be just and fear not," and operating with quasi-military discipline. While their immediate targets were criminals and corrupt politicians, the vigilantes also held biases. For instance, many were anti-Irish and anti-Catholic, and specifically expelled some Irish Catholic leaders whom they associated with the city's democratic machine. Vigilantism was not limited to San Francisco. In the Sierra Nevada and other mining districts, where formal law was scant, miners often held miners' courts and sometimes lynched murderers or thieves on the spot. In boomtowns like Sonora or Nevada City, vigilance committees occasionally arose to drive out suspected criminals or to deal with rampant gambling and vice. Los Angeles in the 1850s, with a scant and overwhelmed police force, also saw vigilantism. For example, the lynching of an accused American killer of a popular local Californio in 1854 by a mob, or the hanging of a notorious bandit gang leader by citizens in 1857. These actions were extra-legal, but in those frontier conditions, many saw them as the only effective justice. The legacy of these vigilantes is double-edged. On one hand, they did break the power of certain criminal networks and likely hastened reforms. In San Francisco, after 1856, there was indeed a cleanup of city government, and the People's Party, formed by vigilante leaders, dominated local politics for a few years, bringing more order. On the other hand, they set a precedent that taking law into one's own hands could be acceptable, which is a troubling notion. Moreover, some historians argue that the San Francisco vigilantes were as much about class and ethnic conflict as justice, wealthy Protestants asserting control over a city they feared was dominated by an Irish Catholic underclass and machine politicians. Regardless, the immediate post-gold rush era in California clearly experienced what might be termed a vigilante tradition, part of the mythos of the Wild West, in which citizens use rough justice to impose order, labor, and social unrest in a changing economy. As California moved past the gold rush and into the late 19th century, new kinds of social tensions emerged. The bustling economy created great wealth, but also stark inequalities. San Francisco, in particular, became home to not only millionaires, but also a large working class facing high rents and periodic unemployment. The completion of the railroads and the end of the big silver boom, Comstock Lode, in the mid-1870s led to an economic slowdown. The long depression of the 1870s, triggered by the Panic of 1873, hit California hard. The Bank of California's failure in 1875 shook the economy, unemployment soared, an estimated 20% jobless in San Francisco around 1877, and many businesses closed. In these hard times, laborers began to organize and express their frustration. One early focus of labor action was the railroad workers. The Central Pacific Railroad's labor force was largely Chinese during construction, and in 1867, thousands of Chinese workers staged one of the first large-scale strikes in California history. They halted work across the Sierras, demanding wage increases and shorter hours. The railroad barons starved them out, cutting off food shipments until the men had to give in. But it was a remarkable moment of worker solidarity. In the 1870s, white railroad workers on the new lines also struck occasionally for better conditions, but such efforts were often crushed by the railroad companies, which wielded enormous power over California's economy and politics. The most dramatic episode of labor unrest came in 1877, part of a nationwide wave of strikes and riots known as the Great Railroad Strike, or Great Upheaval. In San Francisco, meetings of the unemployed and workers took place on the Sand Lot near City Hall. These gatherings, which initially were to protest the economy and the power of railroad capitalists, increasingly turned into venting against Chinese laborers who were seen, incorrectly, as the cause of job scarcity and low wages. Dennis Kearney, an Irish immigrant drayman with a gift for oratory, became a leader at these rallies, famously ending his speeches with, "And whatever happens, the Chinese must go." In July 1877, as mentioned, one such meeting erupted into riots targeting Chinese. In the following days, Kearney and others continued to inflame crowds. There were also clashes with police and U.S. troops who were eventually called in to guard Chinatown and key facilities. It was a violent spasm of class and ethnic antagonism intertwined. Kearney was arrested repeatedly for inciting riots, but he became a popular hero to many jobless workers. Out of this ferment, the Working Men's Party of California was formed in 1877-78. With the slogan, "The Chinese must go," and a broader platform attacking the railroad monopolies, and the wealthy, the Working Men's Party rapidly gained political influence. They won seats in a new constitutional convention called in 1878. Though the party itself was short-lived, it managed to imprint its ideas on the 1879 Constitution, the anti-Chinese articles, and some anti-monopoly measures. This was arguably the birth of California's labor movement in a political sense, workers organizing to challenge what they saw as injustices. However, unlike later purely labor-focused unions, the Working Men's Party mixed economic protest with racial exclusion, reflecting the prejudices of its members. Aside from this, there were also beginnings of trade unionism in California. Printers, cigar makers, longshoremen, and other trades formed some of the state's first enduring labor unions in the 1860s and 1870s. An 8-hour workday movement found success early. In 1868, California passed a law declaring 8 hours a legal day's work, though with many loopholes, and it wasn't strongly enforced. San Francisco's craft unions sometimes banded together in short-lived labor councils. We can imagine in the evenings, meetings in smoky halls on Howard Street or in the back of a boarding house where carpenters and typesetters discuss wage standards and how to support each other in disputes with employers. Labor newspapers like the Working Man's Advocate sprung up, giving voice to the discontent of the day. There was social unrest in rural areas as well. The 1850s squatter riots in Sacramento, for instance, saw confrontations between migrant squatters and landowners, some of whom were the old Mexican land grant owners or their American buyers. Violence broke out in 1850 when squatters challenged the land claims of large ranch holders near Sacramento. Several people were killed in gunfights. That animosity tied into the land question discussed before and was part of the chaotic transition from Mexican to American property systems. Law and order issues persisted beyond the vigilante period, too. Outlaws and bandits roamed some parts of the state in the 1860s. The infamous Bandito Joaquin Murrieta in the early 1850s, who became a legendary figure, cast by Mexicans as a folk hero avenging injustices, by Anglos as a vicious robber, or stagecoach robbers like Black Bart in the 1870s, provided a kind of continuing Wild West drama. While such figures were relatively rare, Californians remained captivated by stories of highwaymen and gentleman bandits. The response to them was typically swift law enforcement, or posses. Murrieta was reportedly hunted down by the state rangers in 1853, his supposed severed head exhibited in a jar in a macabre display of justice, and Black Bart was caught by Wells Fargo detectives in 1883. By the 1880s, California was calming in some ways. Vigilantism receded as police forces grew more capable and the court system more established. Labor unrest would continue and evolve, The late 1880s saw more organized Union strikes, like the Railroad Brotherhoods striking in 1886. But the pattern was set. California's boomtown era had given way to a society where class and racial tensions simmered beneath the surface of progress. Vigilantes had enforced a rough order in extraordinary times, and workers' movements had begun to push back against powerful business interests, though often scapegoating minorities. In the quiet analysis of history, these episodes of unrest can be seen as growing pains. The state was maturing from a frenzied frontier to an organized society, and that transition involved conflict between rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, lawlessness and law. On a peaceful night in a California town in 1880, one might have walked past the shuttered shops and seen pasted on a brick wall a tattered flyer calling for a rally of working men, or perhaps the notice of a reward for a wanted criminal. These were signs of the undercurrents that, while largely subdued day to day, occasionally erupted and forced the state to confront questions of justice, equality, and community. Over time, California's institutions would adapt. San Francisco's police force professionalized, labor unions eventually won protections, and the era of lynch mobs and vigilantes faded into legend. But those early struggles left a mark on the collective memory. Cautionary tales of when order breaks down and how ordinary people respond, rightly or wrongly. A bitter aftermath. Native Californians in the post-gold rush years. Amid the rush for wealth and the building of a new society in California, one group suffered unspeakably: the Native American tribes of California. The gold rush unleashed a humanitarian catastrophe for indigenous peoples, one that tragically accelerated in the years that followed. Before the gold rush, California's native population had already been in decline from Spanish and Mexican periods due to mission systems, diseases, and displacement, but they still numbered perhaps 150,000 in 1848. The influx of gold seekers, however, led to violence, disease, and starvation on an unprecedented scale. What came after the gold rush for native Californians was a near-apocalyptic loss of life, land, and culture, a chapter that some historians have unequivocally termed a genocide. In the first few years of the rush, conflicts erupted as miners encroached on native lands, polluted streams, and ran roughshod over resources. Miners often viewed native people as obstacles or nuisances to be removed. The new state's leaders openly advocated extermination. In 1851, California's first governor, Peter Burnett, declared a chilling prophecy: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. Burnett claimed this outcome was beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert, effectively washing his hands of responsibility, even as the state set policies that facilitated such a war. Indeed, the state government and many citizens took that statement almost literally. Between 1850 and 1861, the California legislature authorized and funded a series of militia campaigns against Native Americans. State bonds and funds, eventually totaling about $1.5 million, were allocated to pay volunteers to hunt down and kill or displace Native people. These state militia expeditions, often in response to real or perceived conflicts, swept through areas like the Sierra foothills, the North Coast, and the southern deserts, often attacking native villages indiscriminately. The Mariposa Battalion in 1851, for example, was formed to retaliate against the Ahwahnachie people near Yosemite after some prospectors were killed. They destroyed villages and effectively drove native peoples out of Yosemite Valley, opening it, ironically, to later become a tourist site and eventually a protected park. In 1852, militias in the Clear Lake area perpetrated the Bloody Island Massacre, killing perhaps 100 Pomo people, including women and children, in revenge for the killing of 2 ranchers who had brutally enslaved and abused them. Incidents like the Old Shasta Massacre of 1851 saw miners in Northern California slaughter around 300 Wintu Indians in one raid. The litany of massacres is long and harrowing. Bridge Gulch, 1852, Wintu people killed. Yontoket, 1853, Tolowa people killed during a prayer ceremony, and on and on. Some communities, like the Yuki in the Mendocino area, were nearly wiped out by settler militias and vigilantes between 1856 and 1860. In addition to state-organized violence, there was much unorganized brutality. Local settlers sometimes acted on their own or formed posses to attack Native Americans after any conflict or theft, real or alleged. There are heart-wrenching accounts of small-scale killings that never made headlines. A rancher might poison a tribe's food supply, or a group of men might raid a native camp at night. There was effectively impunity for those who killed Indians. California law and courts almost never held any white accountable for crimes against Native people. Indigenous people, on the other hand, were criminalized through laws like the aforementioned 1850 Act, which allowed arresting them as vagrants and binding them to forced labor. It was not uncommon for children to be kidnapped and sold as apprentices, a practice that amounted to slave trade and was condoned under the loose legal cover of the State Act. All this led to a precipitous decline in the native population. While exact figures are impossible to know, estimates suggest that by 1870, Native Californians numbered only about 30,000, a decline of 80% or more from pre-gold rush numbers in just 2 decades. Thousands died violently. Many others succumbed to diseases like smallpox and measles introduced by newcomers, or to starvation as their food sources, game, acorns, fish, were wiped out or their lands taken. Entire tribes were displaced from their ancestral homes. The Miwok and Maidu of the Gold Country, the Yokuts of the Central Valley, the Wintu and Karuk of the far north, virtually every group reeled from the onslaught. There were some attempts at relief, or at least containment. In 1851-52, federal agents negotiated 18 treaties with various California tribes, promising them small reservations and aid if they would cease hostilities. Many native groups agreed, ceding vast portions of land in exchange for some protection. But California's state officials vehemently opposed these treaties. They did not want valuable land tied up for reservations or any formal acknowledgement of native rights. Under pressure from the California delegation, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaties and even sealed them in secrecy. Their existence was not widely known until decades later. This betrayal left California's tribes with essentially no recognized rights to their land at all, fueling more incursions by settlers. Only in later years were a few small reservations established, often in remote, unwanted areas. Many desperate natives in the 1860s ended up herded into squalid concentration camps or reservations such as the Round Valley Reservation in Northern California, where different tribal groups were forced together and suffered from disease and malnutrition. Some native individuals and groups fought back, resisting the invaders in various ways. There were skirmishes and a few protracted conflicts, known as the California Indian Wars. For instance, the Chumash and Yokuts fought U.S. Army forces in the Sierra foothills in 1856. The Modoc War of 1872-73 in the lava beds along the Oregon border saw Modoc leader Captain Jack hold off U.S. troops for months before being captured. The Modoc had left their reservation and tried to return to their homeland. They were eventually forced back, and Captain Jack was executed. The Bannock and Paiute conflicts affected the northeastern part of California in the 1870s as well, but these were isolated stands, ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer number of settlers and military might against them. By the late 1870s, it was painfully evident that California's indigenous peoples had been marginalized to the brink of destruction. A few voices of conscience spoke out. Some Eastern newspapers and humanitarians decried the outrages being committed. In 1861, President Lincoln appointed a special Indian agent, and later some missionaries and advocates tried to improve reservation conditions. However, mainstream California society largely either supported the removal of Indians or looked the other way. It's important to note that in the midst of darkness, Native communities tried to sustain themselves and their cultures. Families hid in forests or canyons to avoid massacres. Elders passed down stories and language in secret, and some groups like the Pomo and Hupa managed to maintain a continuous presence in parts of their homelands. When the gold rush generation had passed, survivors would later regroup to fight for recognition, decades later into the 20th century. But within the time frame after the gold rush, it was a bleak era. By 1880, outside observers noted that many California tribes had faded into history, a tragic euphemism for being wiped out or assimilated under duress. In the context of our calm narrative, the fate of California's first peoples stands as a somber counterpoint to the usual tales of progress and prosperity. While new cities rose and fields bloomed, the original stewards of the land mourned an irreplaceable loss. One might picture a quiet hillside at twilight in 1870, once the site of a native village that had stood for generations. Now perhaps only a few scattered acorn-grinding stones remain by an oak grove, silent under the darkening sky, while in the distance the lights of a miner's cabin or a farmer's ranch house twinkle. The land itself remembers what happened, even if many of the new inhabitants did not. Only generations later would Californians more fully acknowledge this grievous chapter of their history. For the purposes of our story, it reminds us that the end of the gold rush was not the end of struggle. For some, it marked the beginning of an even more desperate fight for survival. Scars on the land. Environmental consequences of the gold rush and beyond. The gold rush and the rapid development that followed left an indelible mark not only on California's people, but also on its natural environment. In the mid-19th century, California's landscape was exceptionally rich and diverse. Towering redwood forests along the foggy northern coast, endless oak-studded savannas in the interior valleys, crystal clear salmon-filled rivers running from the Sierra Nevada, and expansive wetlands in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. By the end of the 1800s, many of those landscapes had been significantly altered. The pursuit of gold, and later the expansion of farms, railroads, and cities, came at a steep environmental price. Yet even as damage was done, there were the first glimmers of an American conservation ethic beginning to take shape in California, partly in response to witnessing nature's degradation. In a gentle, reflective manner, let us explore how the land itself fared in the aftermath of the gold rush. Perhaps the most dramatically scarred areas were the Sierra Nevada foothills, where gold mining concentrated. Early placer mining, panning and sluice boxes in streams, disturbed riverbeds and muddied waters, but was relatively localized. However, as easy gold played out, miners turned to hydraulic mining by the 1860s, essentially an industrial scale of mining that amounted to literal landscape demolition. Hydraulic miners built dams and ditches to accumulate high-pressure water, then used monitors, giant iron nozzles, to blast entire hillsides with powerful jets of water. This process washed away mountains, sending massive slurry of mud, gravel, and rocks, called slickens, downslope. People described the California landscape as looking like it had been dug up by giant moles, one historian recounts. Indeed, anyone visiting sites like Malakoff Diggins or Dutch Flat in the 1870s would witness surreal cavernous pits and cliff banks of bare earth where once wooded hills had stood. Hydraulic mining in the Sierra Nevada, as shown above, was an awe-inspiring yet devastating sight. High-pressure water cannons, nicknamed monitors, could blast entire hillsides into oblivion, freeing gold but sending billions of tons of sediment downstream. The once verdant foothills were left pitted and barren like a moonscape gouged by giants. Such mining practices turned clear creeks into sludge-choked channels and caused enormous environmental damage. The debris from hydraulic mining caused tremendous downstream damage. Rivers like the Yuba, American, and Feather were choked with mud. Farmlands in the valleys began to suffer frequent floods as river channels filled in and overflowed. A layer of mining sediment blanketed once fertile fields. By one estimate, hydraulic mining in the Yuba River watershed alone dislodged about 685 million cubic yards of debris, enough to bury the entire island of Manhattan under 10 feet of muck. This sediment traveled far. It clogged the Sacramento River and even began to extend the coastline at the Sacramento River's delta, changing the bay's hydrology. Mercury, which miners used by the ton to amalgamate fine gold particles, washed into waterways as well. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin, and to this day, some fishing spots in the Sierra carry warnings due to 19th century mercury residue in the food chain. The conflict between miners and farmers escalated through the 1860s and 1870s. Farmers in the Central Valley, whose orchards and crops were being buried or whose lands were flooding, organized to fight hydraulic mining. This led to one of America's first environmental legal battles. In 1883, Cirp 84, a lawsuit by Valley farmers, Woodruff v. North Bloomfield Mining Co., resulted in Judge Lorenzo Sawyer issuing an injunction effectively banning hydraulic mining in California's navigable waters. The Sawyer decision of 1884 declared that the mining debris was a public nuisance and prohibited its discharge, essentially shutting down the giant monitors. Hydraulic mining, which had yielded great wealth and some $170 million in gold between 1860 and 1880, came to an abrupt end, or at least was severely curtailed to areas where debris could be contained. California thus witnessed arguably the nation's first environmental victory for agricultural and community interests over unbridled resource extraction. Malcolm Rorbo noted, by the mid-1870s, the California government realized that agriculture was more lucrative than mining and acted to protect it. Beyond mining, the environment was affected in other profound ways. The gold rush and subsequent growth led to massive deforestation. Timber was needed for mine supports, building towns, fueling steamships and locomotives, and later for railroad ties and bridges. The result was widespread logging. In the Sierra, whole hillsides of pine and cedar were stripped. In the coastal ranges, the giant redwoods, those ancient trees, fell to the axe at alarming rates. The Santa Cruz Mountains and Marin County saw the near disappearance of their primeval redwood forests by the 1880s. An observer lamented that trees older than the Roman Empire were being cut to build boomtown saloons or fence rails. The habitat loss was enormous. Species that relied on old-growth forests, from salmon in shaded streams to elusive fishers and martins, lost ground. Vast tracts of forest were felled, leading some to note that California's hills looked oddly naked where once thick timber stood. Wildlife populations also felt the impact. During and after the gold rush, hunting and trapping intensified to feed and supply the newcomers. Elk, pronghorn, and deer were overhunted in many areas. Grizzly bears, California's emblem on its flag, were particularly seen as threats or nuisances and were hunted relentlessly. By the late 1800s, the California grizzly was essentially exterminated in the wild. The last known was shot in the 1920s, but effectively they were gone from most of the state by 1880. Beavers, whose dams had been common in Sierra streams, were trapped out. Waterfowl that once darkened the skies over Central Valley marshes found those marshes drained for farms by century's end. One can imagine an old Yokuts man around 1875 standing by a quiet slough in the San Joaquin Valley that he knew as a boy swarming with geese and ducks, now finding it silent, the tools cut and fields of wheat in their place. The rapid urban growth also introduced pollution, human and industrial. San Francisco's Bay became an accidental repository for an incredible variety of waste. Raw sewage from the mushrooming city, chemicals from tanneries and gasworks, sawdust from lumber mills, and the pervasive hydraulic mining silt carried down rivers. By the 1870s, parts of the Sacramento River near the Delta were described as streams of mud in spring. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, once a lush wetland with innumerable channels and islets, was being diked and drained for agriculture by companies often staffed with Chinese laborers, ironically repurposing them from gold mining to taming the environment. Those reclamation projects created farmland, but destroyed waterfowl habitat and altered the hydrology significantly. Yet in this era, Californians also began to recognize the unique beauty of their land and the need to protect it. In 1864, at the height of the Civil War, Congress, influenced by early conservationists and artists' reports, granted Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias to the state of California to preserve for public use, resort, and recreation. This was the first instance of the U.S. government setting aside natural scenic lands specifically for protection and public enjoyment, preceding even the first national park. It was a direct consequence of the wonder people felt upon seeing places like Yosemite, ironically discovered by the Mariposa Battalion during an Indian campaign, and the giant trees. While California mismanaged Yosemite for a time, the seeds of preservation were sown. By 1872, the federal government created Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Later, in 1890, Yosemite would become a national park as well, along with Sequoia and Kings Canyon parks, thanks in part to activists like John Muir, who fell in love with the High Sierra. Muir arrived in California in 1868 and was awestruck by its remaining wild places. He also witnessed the environmental destruction and became a passionate voice to make the mountains glad by protecting them from unrestrained exploitation. Another environmental consequence, tied to the gold rush, was the beginning of California's complex water infrastructure story. As miners and farmers competed for water, and as cities grew in semi-arid regions, the need for water management became apparent. Early attempts included small-scale irrigation ditches and municipal waterworks. For instance, San Francisco's Spring Valley Water Company started in the 1860s to secure water for the city, ultimately leading to dams and reservoirs in the Coast Range. Farmers in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys began forming irrigation districts by the late 19th century to channel river water to their fields. While these developments mostly came to fruition in the early 20th century with big dams and aqueducts, the post-gold rush period was when Californians first seriously contended with distributing water in a land of seasonal drought. Mark Twain, who roamed the foothills in the 1860s, reputedly quipped, "Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over." And indeed, some of the first water rights lawsuits and local conflicts, farmers versus miners, towns versus private water companies, occurred in these decades, setting precedents for Western water law, such as prior appropriation, a doctrine stating first in time, first in right for water usage, different from traditional riparian rights. Summing up the environmental impact, by around 1880, one could see California's natural wealth both utilized and depleted in parts. Golden foothills turned muddy badlands and mining districts, clear rivers diminished by silt, wildlife populations thinned, forests cut back to stumps. And yet, California was so vast and varied that wilderness still existed aplenty in high mountains and remote areas, awaiting a later generation's protection. Already, tourists were coming by train to see the grandeur of Yosemite or to marvel at the big trees, sequoias, indicating a shifting value towards nature's beauty, not just its resources. In a reflective, tranquil moment, one might stand on a bluff above the Yuba River around 1885. The evening sun casts long shadows on the strangely sculpted cliffs carved by hydraulic monitors years ago, raw earth exposed in reds and yellows. Below, the river meanders in a widened, shallow channel clogged with gravel. Perhaps willows and brush are slowly reclaiming the edges, and a lone heron picks its way through the muck, seeking frogs. There's a silence where once there was the thunder of water cannons and the shouts of miners. The land is healing slowly, but it bears its scars as lessons. In the distance, beyond the wrecked hills, the outline of intact forest and snowy peaks remind us that not all was lost, and indeed, people had begun to set aside some of these treasures for the future. California's environment, in the post-gold rush era, had been a battleground between the drive for progress and the need for preservation. The resolution of that battle would continue into the next century, but already the dual legacy was clear. Abundant prosperity wrested from nature and a cautionary tale of how easily natural riches can be squandered without care. Legends and lasting echoes, myth and legacy of the frontier. As the 19th century wound down, the frenetic immediacy of the gold rush gave way to reflection and commemoration. What came after the gold rush was not only physical transformation, it was a transformation in how the era was remembered and mythologized. The experiences of those tumultuous years on the California frontier became the stuff of legend, inspiring dime novels, epic poems, Wild West shows, and family lore. A cultural legacy grew around the image of the rugged 49er and the boomtown gambler, the kindly gold camp madam and the Chinese laundryman, the beleaguered native survivor, and the intrepid pioneer wife. These images, sometimes romanticized and sometimes tragic, contributed to the broader myth of the American West, a myth that California occupies a central place in. One of the immediate cultural impacts was in literature and the arts. The gold rush and its aftermath gave rise to a distinct body of stories, often penned by those who experienced or closely remembered the era. Bret Harte, writing in the 1860s and 1870s from California, crafted short stories that became wildly popular worldwide. In tales like The Luck of Roaring Camp, 1868, and The Outcasts of Poker Flat, 1869, Harte depicted mining camps with a mix of realism, humor, and sentimentality. The Luck of Roaring Camp, for instance, imagines a rough camp of miners coming together to care for a newborn baby, a symbol of innocence amid their rough lives, and it portrayed the miners as capable of gentleness and sacrifice. Such stories helped cement the archetype of the gold miner with a heart of gold, even if reality was often harsher. Mark Twain, who spent formative years in Nevada and California in the 1860s, also wove gold rush country into American literature. His book, Roughing It, 1872, is a semi-autobiographical romp through the Wild West, including the silver mining towns of Nevada, sprung from the same population that left California's gold fields, and scenes in San Francisco and the foothills. Twain's tall tales, like the famous short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, set in a mining camp tavern, added a comic, legendary air to gold rush locales. These writings, widely read, shaped popular perceptions. They often presented the frontier as a place of adventure, quirky characters, and occasional pathos, feeding an appetite for nostalgic reverence of the days of old, the days of gold. The mythologizing also occurred in popular entertainment. Traveling lecturers and veterans of the gold rush would regale audiences back east with yarns of their California days. In the 1870s, Wild West shows, like those later made famous by Buffalo Bill, were still in their infancy, but Western melodramas on stage enjoyed audiences. A play titled Gold Rush or Oath of the 49ers might have been staged, featuring daring mine rescues and barroom brawls, thrilling genteel theater goers with a sanitized version of frontier roughness. The names of actual places, Tombstone, Deadwood, Coloma, Sutter's Mill, gained a legendary sheen. California itself commemorated its pioneers. As early as the 1860s, societies of California pioneers were formed in San Francisco and other cities, where aging 49ers would gather, swap stories, and congratulate themselves on their role in American destiny. They celebrated Admission Day, September 9th, marking California's statehood, with parades and banquets, often invoking the memory of 1849 and the heroic trials of the pioneers. The first governor born in California, Romualdo Pacheco, in 1875, was hailed as evidence of the state's maturation beyond the gold rush generation. But it was those early days people often looked back to with fascination. Curiously, while some truths of the gold rush were glossed over in these myths, such as the extreme hardship or the injustice to Native Americans and Chinese, other truths were elevated to near legend accurately. For example, the sheer openness of opportunity and the rapid social mobility. Countless family histories recount an ancestor arriving with nothing, striking it moderately rich, or at least carving out a living, and leaving a legacy. A tale that fit neatly with the emerging concept of the American dream. California came to symbolize opportunity and rebirth in the popular imagination, a place where one could start anew and maybe hit the jackpot, a notion that would echo in later eras, from the Dust Bowl migrants in the 1930s to the tech entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley. It is no coincidence that California's state motto became Eureka, Greek for I have found it, referencing the moment of discovery. This motto, emblazoned on the state seal adopted in 1849, itself enshrined the gold rush's spirit and the idea of sudden prosperity. Another part of the legacy was the frontier justice and libertarian ethos that the gold rush spawned. The image of the self-reliant miner who both followed his own code and banded together in miners' meetings to govern themselves contributed to Frederick Jackson Turner's famous 1893 Frontier Thesis, which argued that the American character was shaped by the existence of a frontier and the process of taming it. California's experience, going from wilderness to statehood almost overnight, was an extreme example of that. Turner noted how California's leap to statehood, skipping territorial adolescence, due to the gold rush was unprecedented. In the collective memory, this became a point of pride. California, the restless, innovative, slightly unruly child of the Union, was raised by 49ers who didn't wait for Washington, D.C. to tell them how to govern their gold mountain. The gold rush also left a heritage of legends and folk heroes. Some were real individuals whose deeds were embellished. John Sutter, James Marshall, Lotta Crabtree, a child entertainer in The Camps turned famous actress, Black Bart the Gentleman Bandit, Leland Stanford the grocer turned rail baron, Lola Montez the flamboyant performer who danced for miners, Emperor Norton the eccentric San Francisco character. Others were composites or fictional. The grizzled 49er with a pick and a mule became a stock figure in stories and eventually on early Hollywood screens. The concept of the Wild West that formed in the late 19th century mind owes much to the image of California's lawless, yet strangely principled mining towns, places where a man's word and a loaded revolver might matter more than any legal document, but where fairness could still spontaneously arise from community consensus, as in miners' courts or vigilante actions. That image would later be refined and exported by Hollywood westerns, often set in generic frontier towns, but inspired by actual gold rush anecdotes. Meanwhile, the darker aspects of the gold rush were for many decades downplayed in popular narratives. Only later in the 20th century did historians bring to light the full extent of things like the Native American genocide or the exploitation of certain laborers. In the late 1800s, mainstream accounts often justified or omitted these. Native peoples were depicted, if at all, as tragic but fading figures of a bygone era. A common sentiment was that they were a doomed race, which inevitably perished before civilization, echoing Governor Burnett's fatalistic words. Chinese were acknowledged for contributions to railroad building, but their exclusion and mistreatment was often rationalized by the prejudices of the time. However, some contemporary voices did challenge the rosy myth. Writers like Helen Hunt Jackson, though focused on Southern California Indians in her 1880s novel Ramona, and certain journalists critiqued the injustices, planting seeds for later historical revision. But such critiques were not yet part of the popular mythos. They simmered beneath it. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. Essentially, settlement had spanned coast to coast. In California, one could argue the frontier ended even earlier, perhaps by the 1870s, as railroads and fences partitioned the land. But the idea of the frontier lived on as a powerful cultural force. California's gold rush became in memory a kind of American founding myth, akin to Plymouth Rock or the Revolution, but for the West. School textbooks recounted the romance of 49 paintings and illustrations, like those by Charles Knoll or later artists, portrayed strapping miners and majestic landscapes, and local traditions, such as the Calaveras County frog jumping contest, immortalized by Twain, persisted as fun links to the past. Even the sports team names and local monikers echo this legacy. The University of California at Berkeley took on the team name Golden Bears, a nod to the state symbol and indirectly the Gold Rush era environment. Much later, the San Francisco football team would be the 49ers, directly commemorating those first adventurers. Towns like Placerville still proudly use their nicknames, Old Hangtown from the Wild Days, albeit in a tongue-in-cheek way for tourists. California commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Gold Rush in 1898 with festivals, and in 1890s San Francisco, an elderly Argonaut, as they called the Gold Rush pioneers, after the mythical seekers of the Golden Fleece, was treated with respect, much like a Civil War veteran in other parts of the country. In a tranquil and introspective mood, one could say that what came after the Gold Rush, in spirit, was a great legend, a story that people told themselves to make sense of what they had been through and to inspire future generations. The reality of California after the Gold Rush was complex. Rapid economic and civic development, grievous injustices and losses, environmental change and innovation, cultural clashes and blending. The myth often simplified this into a narrative of brave pioneers and eventual triumph of civilization. But myths have their purpose. They gave Californians a shared identity and gave Americans a sense of the West as a place of both opportunity and lawless charm. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the children and grandchildren of the 49ers could still recall sitting by the fireplace or campfire, hearing the old tales, how Grandpa dug a fortune out of the Stanislaus River, or how Grandma crossed the Isthmus of Panama in a fever to reach San Francisco. These stories, told in a mellow voice on a quiet evening, passed into folklore. They helped keep the gold rush alive long after the last pick and shovel were laid to rest. And indeed, even today, the phrase gold rush evokes a time of innocence and adventure, of fortunes made and lost overnight, and of a beautiful, rugged land that promised so much to so many. In the broader sweep, The gold rush and its aftermath firmly planted California in the world's imagination as a place of endless possibility, a golden state not just in mineral wealth, but in spirit. That legacy would attract new dreamers in new eras, from film directors to aerospace engineers to digital pioneers, each with their own rush. But that is another story. In the gentle close of our tale, we acknowledge that the period after the California Gold Rush set the stage for a century of growth and change, and left behind stories that would be told and retold like a gentle refrain through the nights to come. Conclusion: twilight of an era, dawn of a legacy. By the late 19th century, California had emerged from the chaotic cradle of the gold rush, transformed and matured. The frenzied diggings had given way to orderly towns and thriving cities. In the calm twilight of an autumn day in 1890, one might stand at Sutter's Mill by the American River, now a quiet historical relic rather than a buzzing hive of miners, and reflect on the journey that unfolded from those first golden flakes. The river still flows softly, as it did before James Marshall's fateful discovery, but the world around it is utterly changed. Where once only native Nisenan people wandered, now there are farms and roads, schools, and railways. California, after the gold rush, was a land of juxtaposition, tremendous growth and innovation on one hand, and deep wounds and lessons on the other. We saw how gold seekers became farmers and merchants, how tent camps became Sacramento and San Francisco, how a frontier of violence and vigilantes evolved into a society of laws, if imperfectly applied at first. We traced the sorrowful path of native peoples who bore the brunt of this rapid conquest, and we acknowledged the contributions of immigrants from around the globe who added their threads to California's social fabric. We followed rivers that ran thick with gold and then with mud, observing how nature herself was a participant and victim in this grand saga, hills leveled, forests felled, but also the first seeds of conservation planted. And we listened to the echoes of stories, the foundation of a mythos that would forever brand California as a place where dreams and sometimes nightmares can manifest overnight. In a sleep-friendly voice, we gently gather these threads together. The California that came after the gold rush was by 1900 a place of settled opportunity. It had universities and opera houses, state parks, and busy harbors. The feverish improvisation of the 1850s had solidified into institutions, constitutions, companies, rail networks, and communities. Yet the aura of the gold rush never fully faded. It remained like gold dust sparkling in the collective memory, inspiring, cautionary, legendary. People still greeted each other with tales of 49 on their lips, and the state's motto, Eureka, reminded everyone that California's identity was forever tied to discovery and daring. The legacy of those post-gold rush decades is all around us today. In the agricultural bounty of the Central Valley, in the cosmopolitan diversity of California's cities, in the notion of the West as a place of reinvention. The frontier closed, but its spirit carried forward. Now, as we conclude this immersive journey, imagine night settling over the Sierra foothills. The bustling mines are long silent. Perhaps a lonely coyote's howl can be heard in the distance. The towns and farms below emanate a soft glow of lamplight. A train whistle sounds faintly on the horizon, a reminder of how linked this land has become with the wider world Since those isolated days of 1849, California rests, enriched and exhausted by the tumult of its first great drama. In this calm, one can almost sense the ghosts of that era, 49ers by their campfires, prospectors bent over a stream, a stagecoach rattling along a mountain road. They fade into the night as the present moves on. What came after the California gold rush? We asked. The answer is a tapestry of humanity and nature, of immense change. It is the story of a society picking up the pieces of a shattered status quo and forging something new and enduring. It is a story of lessons learned the hard way and achievements earned the hard way too. As you drift to rest, carry with you the image of California's golden hills in the evening. Once wild with gold-fueled frenzy, now peaceful, dotted with oak trees and the lights of farmhouses, a land that has found a new kind of gold in its soil, its people, and its future. The frontier chapter closes, but the California story continues, ever evolving under the same broad skies that witness the madness and the magic of the gold rush.